Wanted to briefly discuss the partial pressure gradients of oxygen and CO2 as we move from the lungs into the tissues and back into the lungs. When we start in the lungs, we have a high pressure concentration gradient for oxygen. It's about 104. So it's moving from the alveoli into the blood, binding to hemoglobin and moving throughout the body. As it binds to hemoglobin, we drop a little bit, so it's about 95 as we pass through and down to the tissues. As we pass into the tissues, remember that we have a lower pH in the tissues, so hemoglobin will not bind oxygen as well. The oxygen is released, and we decrease our pressure gradient. So we end up with a partial pressure gradient of about 40 millimeters of mercury on the venous side, which returns to the heart. CO2 is about 40 in the beginning up here. As we drop down to the tissues on the venous side, it's about 45. So CO2 moves from the tissues into the red blood cells, gets carried back to the lungs, and we breathe it out. And that's basically how it works. I would remind you to know the pHs of the lungs and the tissues. Simply that we have a higher pH in the lungs, so oxygen will bind to hemoglobin more effectively. While in the tissues, we get a lower pH, and that causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin, and we can actually have hemoglobin or oxygen in our muscles and in our tissues.